efficiently. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Kyle Craig coming out of the house. He was in a hurry, as he always is. We shook hands. "They just moved Alex," he said. "He's hanging on." "What's the prognosis?" Kyle averted his eyes. "Not good. They say he won't live. They're sure he won't live." The press corps intercepted Kyle and me as we headed toward the Cross House. The vultures effectively blocked our way, wouldn't let us pass. They knew who Kyle was, and possibly they knew about me, too. "Why is the FBI already involved?" one of them shouted above the street noise and general commotion. "We hear this is connected to the Sonigi case. Is that true? Is Alex Cross still alive?" someone called out. "Dr. Cross is alive. As you can see, I just got here, so I don't know much. So far, we have no suspects, no theories, no leads, nothing particularly interesting to talk about," I said. I pulled Kyle Craig out of there with me, holding on to his arm for support as much as anything. I had been working hard at Quantico, reporting in on the gruesome and complex Mr. Smith investigation, when the news arrived about the attack on Cross. Actually, I had been in Quantico for less than a day, having just returned from England, where Smith was blazing his killer trail and I was in lukewarm pursuit. Now I was in Washington at the center of a raging storm over the Cross family attack. I looked at my watch, a Tag Heuer 6000 given to me by Isabella, the only material possession I really care about. It was a few minutes past 11 when I entered the Cross front yard. I noted the time. Something about it bothered me, but I wasn't sure what it was yet. I stopped beside a battered and rusting EMS truck. The roof lights were flashing, the rear doors thrown open. I looked inside and saw a boy. It had to be Damon Cross. The boy had been badly beaten. His face and arms were bloody, but he was alert and talking in a soft voice to the medics. "Why wouldn't he have killed the children? Why just thrash out at them?" Kyle said. "His heart wasn't in it," I said. "He was compelled to make a symbolic gesture toward the Cross children, but no more than that." I looked up at the old house. "I need to see Alex Cross's room. I don't know, but I think something is seriously fucked up here. This certainly wasn't done by Gary Sonigi or his ghost." "How do you know that?" Kyle grabbed my arm and made eye contact. "How can you know for sure?" "Sonigi would have killed the two kids and the grandmother." Alex Cross's blood was spattered everywhere in the corner bedroom. I could see where a bullet had exited through the window directly behind Cross's bed. The glass fracture was clean and the radial lines even. The shooter had fired from a standing position directly across the bed. I made my first notes and also a quick sketch of the small, unadorned bedroom. There was other evidence. A shoe print had been discovered near the cellar. The Metro Police were working on a walking picture of the assailant. A white male had been spotted around midnight in the mostly black neighborhood. For a moment, I was almost glad I'd been rushed up here from Virginia. There was so much raw data to take in and process, almost too much. The mussed bed, where Cross had apparently slept on top of a hand-sewn quilt. Alex Cross had been moved to St. Anthony's Hospital, but his bedroom was intact, just the way the mysterious assailant had left it. I looked at the papers still out on Cross's small work desk. They were notes on Gary Sonigi. They had been left undisturbed by the assailant. Was that important? Someone had taped a short poem to the wall over the desk. "Wealth covers sins. The poor are naked as a pin." Cross had been reading a book called Push, a novel. A piece of lined yellow paper was stuck inside, so I read it. "Write the talented author about her wonderful book." I had been inside Cross's bedroom for almost an hour and a half, lost in forensic detail, hooked on the case in spite of myself. I heard footsteps thumping outside in the hallway and looked up, my concentration interrupted. The bedroom door suddenly swung open and thudded against the wall. Kyle Craig popped his head inside. His face was white as chalk. Something had happened. "Alex has gone into cardiac arrest." On the ride over to St. Anthony's, I gently questioned Kyle about the extent of Dr. Cross's injuries and the tenor of concern at the hospital. I also made a guess about the cause of the cardiac arrest. "It sounds like it's due to blood loss. There's a lot of blood in the bedroom. It's all over the sheets, the floor, the walls. Soniji was obsessed with blood, right? I heard that at Quantico before I left this morning." In the spring of 1992, I had just graduated from Harvard Medical School. My life seemed to be spiraling upward at dizzying speed when the woman I loved more than life itself was murdered in our apartment in Cambridge. Isabella Calais was my lover, and she was my best friend. She was one of the first victims of Mr. Smith. After the murder, I never showed up at Massachusetts General, where I'd been accepted as an intern. 18 months after the murder, I was accepted into the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, what some wags call the BS Group. Once I had proven myself in the BSU, I asked to be put on the Mr. Smith case. My superiors fought the move at first, but finally they gave in. At St. Anthony's Hospital, I left Kyle and roamed about playing doc. I tried to find out as much as I could about Alex Cross's condition and his chances of surviving his wounds. The staff nurses and doctors were surprised that I understood so much about trauma and gunshot wounds, but no one pressed me as to how or why. They were too busy trying to save Alex Cross's life. I learned that the cardiac arrest had been caused by the loss of blood, as I had guessed. Alex Cross had gone into massive arrest minutes after he arrived at the ER. His blood pressure had dipped dangerously low, 60/0. The staff's prognosis was that he could probably die during the surgery necessary to repair his massive internal injuries, but that he would definitely die without the surgery. Paris, France. The police would never admit it, but Mr. Smith had control of Paris now. He had taken the city by storm, and only he knew why. The news of his fearsome presence spread along Boulevard Saint-Michel and then Rue de Vaugirard. The seductively chic shops along Boulevard Saint-Michel lured tourists and Parisians alike. The Panthéon and beautiful Jardin de Luxembourg were nearby. Lurid murders weren't supposed to happen here. Clerks from the expensive shops were the first to leave their posts and hurriedly walk or run toward number 11 Rue de Vaugirard. They wanted to see Smith, or at least his handiwork. They wanted to see the so-called alien with their own eyes. Shoppers and even owners left the fashionable clothing shops and cafes. If they didn't walk up Rue de Vaugirard, they at least looked down to where several police black and whites and also an army bus were parked. A police inspector named René Fawkes shook his head as he pulled onto Rue Champollion and saw the crowd. Fawkes understood the common man's sick fascination with Mr. Smith. It was the fear of the unknown, especially fear of sudden, horrible death, that drew people's interest to these bizarre murders. That morning, one of the finest young surgeons at École Pratique de Médecins had been reported missing. If Mr. Smith's pattern held, within a couple of days the surgeon would be found dead and mutilated. That was the way it had been with all the other victims. It was the only strand that represented anything like a repeating pattern, death by mutilation. Fawkes nodded and said hello to a couple of flics and another low-ranking inspector inside the surgeon's expensively furnished apartment. "Nothing? No sign of a struggle?" Fawkes asked the closest flic as he entered the apartment. "Not a trace, just like the others. The poor rich bastard is gone, though. He's disappeared, and Mr. Smith has him." The inspector went to examine the handiwork of Mr. Smith. He had a procès-verbal to write up. All of France, all of Europe, waited to hear the latest news. FBI headquarters in Washington is located on Pennsylvania Avenue between 9th and 10th Streets. I spent from 4 until almost 7 in a bogsat with a half-dozen special agents, including Kyle Craig. Bogsat is a bunch of guys sitting around the table. We vigorously discussed the Cross attack inside a Strategic Ops Center conference room. At 7 that night, we learned that Alex Cross had made it through the first round of surgery. A cheer went up around the table. I told Kyle that I wanted to go back to St. Anthony's Hospital. "I need to see Alex Cross," I told him. "I really do need to see him, even if he can't talk, no matter what condition he's in." 20 minutes later, I was in an elevator headed to the 6th floor of St. Anthony's. I entered a private recovery room near the center of the semi-darkened floor. Detective John Sampson was standing vigil by the bed of his friend. Sampson was tall and powerful, at least 6'6", but he looked incredibly weary, as if he was ready to fall over from exhaustion and the long day's stress. Alex Cross was hooked up to so many machines it was a visceral shock to see him. I studied the charts at the base of the bed. Alex Cross was conscious, and I stared into his brown eyes for a long time. He couldn't talk, and I could see nothing in his eyes, no awareness that I was there with Detective Sampson. He didn't seem to recognize Sampson either.
"Why don't you leave him alone?"
Sampson finally spoke after a few minutes.
"Why don't you leave the both of us? You can't help here. Please go."
I nodded, but continued to look into the eyes of Alex Cross for a few more seconds. Unfortunately, he had nothing to tell me. I finally left Cross and Sampson alone. The moment I awoke in the morning, I called St. Anthony's Hospital. Alex Cross was alive, but in a coma. His condition was listed as extremely critical. By 9 in the morning, I was back at the Cross House. I needed to study the scene in much greater depth, to gather every fact, every splinter and fragment. I tried to organize everything I knew or thought I knew at this early stage of the investigation. I was reminded of a maxim that was frequently used at Quantico. All truths are half-truths, and possibly not even that. A fiendish ghoul had supposedly struck back from the grave and attacked a well-known policeman and his family in their home. The ghoul had warned Dr. Cross that he would come. There was no way to stop it from happening. For some reason, though, the assailant had failed to execute. None of the family members, or even Alex Cross, had been killed. That was the perplexing and most baffling part of the puzzle for me. That was the key. I arrived at the cellar in the Cross house just before 11 in the morning. The attacker had hidden herself, in the basement. There was a partial footprint near the entryway to the cellar. It was a size 9. It wasn't much to go on, not unless the perpetrator had wanted us to find the print. One thing struck me right away. Gary Sinigi had been locked in a cellar as a child. He'd been physically abused in the cellar, just like the one in the Cross house. The attacker had definitely hidden in the cellar. That couldn't be a coincidence. Had he known about Gary Sinigi's explicit warning to Cross? That possibility was disturbing as hell. I tried to imagine the attacker lurking here until Alex Cross finally went to bed. The attacker was a coward. He wasn't in a rage state. He was methodical. It was not a crime of passion. The intruder had struck out at each of the children first, but not fatally. He had beaten Alex Cross's grandmother, but had spared her. Why? Only Alex Cross was meant to die, and so far even that hadn't happened. Had the attacker failed? Where was the intruder now? Was he still in Washington, checking out the Cross house right now? Or at St. Anthony's Hospital, where the Metro Police were guarding Alex Cross? As I passed an ancient coal stove, I noticed the metal door was slightly ajar. I poked it open with my handkerchief and peered inside. I couldn't see very well and took out a penlight. There were inches of ash, which were light gray in color. Someone had burned a flammable substance recently, possibly newspapers or magazines. Why start a fire in the middle of summer, I wondered. A small hand shovel was on a work table near the stove. I used the shovel to sift through the ashes. I carefully scraped along the stove's bottom. I heard a clink, a metal-against-metal noise. I scooped out a shovelful of ash. Something came with the ash. It was hard, heavier. I emptied the ashes onto the work table in a pile, then smoothed it out. I saw what the small shovel had struck. I flipped over the new evidence with the tip of the shovel. It was Alex Cross's detective shield, and it was burned and charred. Someone wanted us